Thanks for coming, everyone. I'm Jay Lyle. I work with JP Systems. I represent the Veterans Administration in the United States. I was just rereading my blurb. It says this session covers best practices for exposing legacy data in FHIR. It's really more solicits best practices for exposing legacy data in FHIR. I don't know if any of you saw May Terry's work on a couple days ago on the business process of getting the data modeled for exposure in FHIR. This is really in the fourth bullet of her process of you've got the data, now you want to get it out there. So we're not defining anything, we're not doing any clinical analysis, we're taking data that exists in a system and figure out, okay, how do we get it out into 3, all right. So I'll give a brief overview of the world I'm living in right now and why the questions look the way they do, and then we have a bunch of sort of kinds of questions that we're looking at to try to get resolved. So today, the VA has a system called Vista. It has thousands and thousands of tables, and it's in mumps, so they're not really tables. They're called files. They have extract tools to get the data out of Vista into other, a menagerie of other kinds of tools for a variety of different purposes. Right now, the project I'm working on is using a HealthShare intersystems tool to create these data objects that are loosely based on V2, HL7 V2 classes, to then expose that data as V2, as CDA, or as FHIR, and so it's an engine for this sort of thing. And it will expose FHIR resources, and these will be then consumed by an application, which is an internal application. So right now, it's not really even being used for interoperability. The idea is that hopefully if they do this correctly, it will be useful in the future for interoperability. But yeah, some of the questions we hit, people scratch their heads and say, why are you doing all this work? We already know what the data looks like. It's internal. This application's predecessor knows what it looks like. Why does the replacement application have to look at it differently? Well, the idea is because we want to do interoperability in the future. And again, so there will be some interesting architectural questions that will come up in your head. But that's why. So the primary trade-off we're looking at is, again, on the one side, people will say, this data works the way it is, just put everything in extensions. We don't even really need to use different resources. We can use a single resource with 800 extensions, and it'll do what we want. But yeah, ideally, we do want to support interoperability in the future. The question is, how much effort is worth it to expose in different formats for different future use cases that we don't actually know today. We just think they're going to be coming down the road in the future. Of about 880 elements, our initial mapping has found about under half mapped directly to FHIR core properties. We're using DSU2, the Argonaut data query specification. Another quarter or so can be mapped using sort of ancillary classes, using Provenance and using observation, and about a third of them have to be extensions. Now, if we go, this is the overall set of fields we're looking at. If we just look at the order space, which is the client, they're much more deeply involved in this. They don't need to know really arcane stuff about the patient or about allergies, but about medications they need to do a lot. So we get a much higher fraction of extensions here because they're much more business process focused. So that's what we're looking at today. I have this table if anyone has particular interest in examining some of the choices we're making that we'll be looking at in a moment. So some basic examples. Patient has, if we have an order number for an order, well, gee, the medication order has an identifier, and we can map that quite easily. That was the blue slice of the pie we saw before. There's an entry attribute in an order. Pharmacy patient is a misnamed file. It's actually an order, but it's an overarching file for the order, so it's called patient. So entry by, there's no entry property in the provenance, in the medication order resource, but there's a provenance, so we can put it in provenance and attach it appropriately. And then there is a priority, which doesn't exist in DSU2. We'll probably use the extension from the R4 property. So these are the kinds of things we're looking at doing. If we do use the R4, then we have this other question of how to map. It is an optional field, but it has a required binding to these FHIR values, and some of them are quite clear and some of them are not quite clear. So in the status domain, we have a fairly stable approach of you do the lossy mapping to the FHIR status and you include that, and then you also have an extension for your local fields that are more detailed. The only question in our head right now is that a extension on the resource or on the element, on the data type? Don't know yet. So the boundaries can overlap. Vista has this thing called requested IV limitation, and in order to know whether that is a limitation on a volume of the IV or the period of time for the IV, you have to look at the data and parse it and say, oh, gee, is that a time unit or is that a volume unit? There is an extension that the pharmacy group defined for volume, but there is no extension for time. So we have two options. We can create a new extension that's ambiguous, that can mean either one, just like the VA field does, or we can use the existing extension and create a new extension that's specific. And I think the star means I think we're going to do the second one. That will be less ambiguous to other partners in the future. And so that is, again, our primary principle at this point is to try to make things interoperable if possible, and whether the implementation team can actually do that is a different question, but we can make the recommendation. A larger question about boundaries is what exactly are we mapping to? The blue boxes are the Vista files. The top one is the order file from the clinical system. It is not visible to the pharmacy system. When the clinician signs the order, it then gets replicated into one of those three files, whether it's something that's going externally in the non-VA meds, something that's an outpatient prescription, or something that's inpatient. It goes in the top three, and then once the pharmacist finishes the order and confirms that the right thing is going to be dispensed, it then gets copied into yet another file, which can be an inpatient unit dose or IV file, or the prescription file. If the prescription is then refilled, it then has this yet another file down here where it gets copied into, and the inpatient things don't have these, they just have the application. This is the barcode medication administration. So this is where you actually have the administration of the. So medication administration, that's fairly straightforward. That's an administration, this is an administration. What's the boundary between the order and the dispense? By doing a field-by-field comparison, we find that almost everything in the inpatient is request. There is no, in the pharmacy system, there is no recognition of the actual identification of the pill or the chemical. That happens within the barcoding system. Outpatient is different. There are dispense-like activities. Some of them happen inside the core file. Some of them happen in the refill file. So there's this dotted line where some of the file 52 items will show up down here. So there's going to be multiple FHIR resources out there for a given file in any case. Whether that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different profiles or 3 profiles with different optionalities, we don't know yet. But that's the kind of thing we're looking at. Any questions so far? Did I go too far? Yes, okay. Question, ambiguity. This is not really a question, this is just a caution. Many of those different files use very similar, even lexically identical status values. On hold, for instance, which we map to on hold in the inpatient, because when something is on hold in the inpatient world, it means don't give it to the patient. However, in the outpatient world, on hold means the patient tried to refill the prescription before it could be refilled, it is not the order but the dispense that is on hold, and so we're mapping the actual order status to active because this is still an active order. So there's a fair amount of subtlety in interpreting what these things mean between the different communities, not only between FHIR communities and implementer communities, but between the different implementer communities, the inpatient and outpatient. This was one of our more painful friction points as we move forward. All right. So about a little more than a tenth, 15% of our elements look like provenance. There's some entered in error circumstances, who did it. There's some signatures and verifications and timing. There's some changelog items. We discussed this with the security work group. Are these provenance? Are these audit events? And their feeling was audit events are really for system audits, and if the data is going to be in front of a practitioner, that it belongs in provenance. So that's the direction we're going. Some of them require a target element. There is a Norwegian, I believe, extension that models how you might say for this provenance element, it's not just for the resource, I'm pointing at the specific element within the resource that was changed. So we want to leverage that. This is a very detailed thing. Observation has a single provenance class associated with it, but the orders may have several. Again, we have signatures, verifications, etc. Verifications by multiple people. So how we deal with this is, I think semantically that's the right approach. Examples, observation, we have a few things that are in observation and a couple things that are not. Provenance, we're going to put entered and place, and whether enter is, there's a business question there that we haven't resolved yet, but that seems clear enough. But if we want to profile this for these kinds of discussions and publication and direction to developers, you can't profile observation because you can't specify an incoming relationship in a profile, to my knowledge. If you can, let me know, because that would be useful. Graph definition, there's the thought, yeah. So the other thought was we could profile provenance, which sounds kind of strange, not exactly the right thing semantically, and also it would work for observation, but for orders, we have more than one provenance, so this wouldn't work for there either. So we're thinking, well, there's some kind of container. It's a bundle or it's a composition. Don't know yet. Composition has a lot of required fields. Graph definition would be another potential ingredient here, but this is one we don't know yet. So if anyone has experience with this, my email address is in here, so we can. I'd love feedback. How are we doing on time? 12:08. Okay. We might finish. Okay, extensions. There are a handful we can reuse that exist. There are a handful that exist that we're going to mimic. This is one of the nice things about being at this meeting is that I learned so much. I've discovered that there's a status reason in R4 that we can use as an extension in R2. Good. I'm glad to see heads nodding there because that was news to me. So there's some existing STU3 translation element. Again, we can do the same thing. We'll adopt it as an extension to R2. The only question is whether in the US realm it's acceptable to adopt extensions that are specifically defined in a different country. So that's the target element we talked about on the provenance. And then we have some complex things. Annotation's nice. It doesn't have quite enough stuff in it, so we want to do that. And on the patient, there's a large number of service history items. So back on the third slide where we saw a bunch of things that were in observation, that's all this. Where'd you serve? What exposures did you have? Agent Orange, that sort of thing. So another question we're grappling with and don't have an answer with yet is, if we do this, if we want to do a rich annotation, is it just an extension that incorporates annotation and two other things, or do we need to profile annotation? And I think this has fewer moving parts, so I'm kind of partial to that. But again, if anyone has done this and has a perspective, let me know. Naming, this is less of a big deal. I think we're going to do this. We want to have the domain. I think we want the owner here. That's going to be in the URL anyway, so you don't really have to have it, but it might be useful. Anyone who has particular preferences one way or the other, or insight into which is more useful in the community, that would be useful as well. Granularity. Okay, here we have two of those order files have placement mode questions, but they have different value sets. Is that two extensions, or is that one extension that I bind to two different value sets in the profile? I think we want one extension, again, to reduce the number of artifacts floating around out there and just keep things as simple as possible. But again, without having implemented, I don't know what kinds of issues we're going to stumble across when we do that. So another open question, another solicitation for best practice. This, how do you coordinate your extensions? Well, we publish them. So again, best practice. What's the best way to do that? We can put them in Simplifier. We can publish them. Once they're balloted, we can publish them in the FHIR registry, but we don't want to do that and give the implication that they are finished and balloted and published until they are. But we do want to share them while they're in process. So what's the best way to get the word out about the fact that they're out there, and we want others to use them as appropriate. Right. Okay, yeah, so this is the thing I mentioned a moment ago, that yes, we can use the extensions in the future because we can make them backward compatible. And right, this slide got much faster 2 days ago. Development coordination, this is more of an internal question. One of the reasons some of these questions have not been answered already is we're a very large organization, and there's a lot of different sub-organizations pushing forward, and it's very difficult to sort of get your head around all the different decisions that are being made. I finally got from 2 different organizations the URI design that they're using. They're different. So we have at least 2 URI endpoints for our enterprise. And is that a problem? Well, maybe not, because one of them is really for a patient-facing application, and the other one, as we said, is for the pharmacy. But then the question becomes, okay, how many endpoints do you want? If there's only 2 and they're that different, it may seem reasonable. But we're going to have many more in the future. So the question is, what's a good number? Is it 2? Is it 7? Is it 20? And again, soliciting experience from people who are doing this to see what's more painful. Is it more painful to force people onto fewer endpoints, or is it more painful to maintain multiple endpoints? Okay, I think those are my questions. I'm going to pause now for questions or answers. Do you all have answers? I heard one answer about graph.
Just before this, in this very room, Renee Strong talked about graph definitions, specifically about the inbound links and how you can sort of profile them or describe them with graph definition. But the kicker there is that it looks like that resource will be redesigned, so it's really not.
Okay.
It's available,
Yeah.
but it's still in flux.
It's pretty bleeding edge.
Yeah, and it's definitely bleeding edge.
All right.
It's R4, R5?
Oh, it's been defined in, I think even before R4, it's in R4. But they're encountering some problems with the descriptive nature of the graph definition.
So the question, or actually the answer to the question, for those on the audio, is that the graph definition was proposed as a way to handle inbound relationships. Can do it, should be able to do it, but it's very unstable and is being redesigned and is kind of bleeding edge, so might not be a solution here. If we do this with a container, does anyone have any gut reaction to whether just bundle or composition would be more appropriate? I think composition, it's got 5 required fields, so it feels too heavy for me for this, but maybe not.
So, I mean, one thought or question back is, what do you want to accomplish with the profiling? Is it an automated validation issue? Is it documentation so people know what they're supposed to create? Because obviously you can create data that has this shape regardless of whether you're able to express it in a profile.
Right. The question is, what's the purpose of profiling? And right now, I'm feeling my way forward. We created maps in spreadsheets, and then I need feedback. And when I show people the spreadsheets, it's got 1,000 rows. It's actually a database, but it's hard to read. So I think the profile will be easier for review and feedback purposes. It will also be easier, I think, for the developers to consume. So I think it would be easier. I don't think it's necessary for validation at this point, but it may be someday. So that's does that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say you should try to document as much as you can with formal profiles, but if you hit a wall like this, just putting a diagram like that in the documentation and saying, by the way, we have a profile and observation, and we like to use it in this way with provenance. Like, you don't necessarily need to be able to express everything in the
True.
profile.
Okay, good point. I get bewildered about the tooling, so okay. Okay, other answers? This was probably the naughtiest one. That wasn't really a question. That's a question. Is there any value in profiling annotation rather than just creating a extension that contains it?
Can you say a little bit more about, just describe what annotation does and what you need?
So as I remember, so annotation has author time and text, so you can have multiple comments and you know when they happened and who did them, et cetera, et cetera. In our data requirements, some of their textual threads that they have on these files have other properties. 2 of them are type, and I cannot recall what types there are, but there's some sort of classification of what sort of comment this is. And some of them need an order, so we need to be able to order them. And time could order it, but you would lose the serial order index that we maybe just need to refactor out. But so at least type would be one of the things that we would want to decorate annotation with.
Over on the left, you have a reference. Does that imply that it would be an external data type?
So yeah, this is a sort of homegrown notation. So blue things are profiles, green things are extensions. So you have, in this profile, we want to include the rich annotation, but you have to maybe you don't. So in the profile, you want to add the extension, but if the rich annotation is a profile, not an extension, then you don't add it, you add the profile. So I think it's just an unnecessary layer. Okay.
One thing I think you can do is, within an annotation, at the level where the author, the time, and the text are defined, just as siblings to those, you could have extensions, rather than trying to wrap it.
Okay.
I think you could just add extensions alongside.
But that would be an extension that contains, right? Because the complex extension is there's still a parent extension that contains.
Yeah, so I guess I'm just saying there's a data type called annotation, which has those 3
Right.
Fields that you mentioned. And rather than creating siblings to that annotation
Mhm.
with these extensions. You could just
Put them inside.
put them inside if there were things you needed to track. They
Right.
could become part of the annotation rather than sitting next to it.
All right. Yeah. Okay. This is probably a good answer. It's 12:20. I think we've gone over. We lost our guide. We were supposed to go to 12:15, right?
12:15.
All right. 12:35. Okay. All right. My slot says 12:15, but this is a 2-slot session with only one slot. So we have 15 minutes, and so you've heard my questions. If you have answers, please answer them. And if you have other questions, we have lots of time. Yes.
This is more of a philosophical question about extensions and stuff. Do your initial point for creating an extension or suggestion is your system or other systems? I mean, if you try to expose as much information to your system to potential consumers, have you thought that do they actually need this information? It's always tempting to have your database, your application, your fields, your columns, and say, okay, why not suggest an extension or profile to expose this information? The question actually is, you start from your own system and you try to expose an API for other systems, or what other systems should need from my system. In another session I heard, don't suggest extensions and profiles for your own system. Try to create a small community of vendors or consumers, and try to cooperate and see what's useful for the others.
Right. So the question, to repeat, is what's the basis for wanting to expose all these things that are useful for my system?
Start from
The-
one system to other systems.
The goal should be to agree on what the interoperability needs are with others, right? Is that a fair restatement?
So this extension doesn't come to be a Vista extension, so
Right.
dedicated for this
Right.
system completely.
So, and that goes back to the problem statement where right now, this business unit has an application that talks directly to this data source in a character interface, and it works. And they're replacing it with this, and they are going to put this in between. So they have to have all the data that they had before in the future. And so some of that fits in FHIR and some of it requires extensions. There is no one else right now at the table. This is the only client, so it's very incestuous. What,
Same problem. It's
Right.
very tempting to have the data model and say, okay, almost take it as it is.
right. I mean, and my first comment, what we could have done is created a patient profile with 800 extensions on it, and not worry about this mapping stuff. But so yeah, that's why I'm here. Is the first step to saying, okay, what else? What other input can we get? And I want to use profiles if possible, so I can publish it in a way that people will understand and other groups can see. So, that you put your finger right on our pain. So, Mark.
You did state that they needed all these elements, and I'm wondering whether you did the business analysis to really prove that maybe there's stuff being copied back and forth that is never really important or never used. So maybe the step 0 would have been reanalyze the business process to minimize what they're really needing.
The question is, we have all these fields we need to move across. Do we really need to do that? Was the business analysis done to determine, what is the actual process and what are the actual requirements. And based on the answers to questions I get, not really. It was sort of done. Again, this is one of the problems of working with a very large organization, is that I can't see that, and it's very frustrating. The business analysis I do is, gee, that field looks redundant, is it? And they'll say, oh, yeah, you're right, you can get rid of that. Or, yeah, it's redundant, but they really need to see it this way. So that's yeah, there's no, that's a piece that's missing, and I don't think there's anything that we can do about it. All right. Oh, thank you. All right, so if there are no further questions or suggestions, I don't want to soak your time up. I will once again request that if any of these shake up any thoughts in your head, that I hear back from you. My address is in here. It's in the app. It's not actually on the slide. I didn't see that on the slide template, so I didn't put it up there. But it's I could do that right now. I'd love to hear from you, and thank you very much for. Whoop, wrong way.